Hello YouTube and hello Inspiring Philosophy. It's been a while. I hope you are well, sir. And by sir I mean Inspiring Philosophy, not the whoever may be watching this video. So I saw Inspiring Philosophy's recent video on the Book of Job. And I do like that video. I posted in his comments that I like the video a lot, and I think it's a valid interpretation. I think he makes some interesting moves with the text and stuff. But I disagree with it. And I'm going to be leaning mainly on things from the text itself. I may quote a thing or two from Chesterton as well. Not that I'm saying that Chesterton is in any way a definitive reading of the Book of Job. G.K. Chesterton is a Christian apologist, and he has a very beautiful reading of the Book of Job called The Introduction to the Book of Job, and I guess I'll leave it in the link below. So let's begin by just doing a quick recap of the Book of Job, the things that we agree on that are in there. They're just the facts of the text. So, gods in heaven and the children of, I think it says, the children of the Lord came unto him, and Satan was among him. And God says, have you considered my servant Job? He is upright in all that he does. He is blameless, and all of this. And Satan replies, well, the only reason why he worships you so much or so well is that you've given him everything he could ever want. He's wealthy. He's well respected. He has kids. He has a wife. He's etc. 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 So God says, all right, well, I put, or the devil says, give me put his life in my hands, and we'll see. He still continues to worship you. God says, all right, go and do it. Just don't touch his flesh. So the devil goes out, and the next day Job is visited by a few servants. Each one telling him that he's lost something different. One tells him that he's lost like all of his livestock. One tells him that all of his kids have died. One tells him, right, everything in Job's life is destroyed in one day. It's obviously a horrific moment. Job shaves his head, puts on robes, I believe, and falls to the ground and prays. And he says the famous line, the Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away. Praise be the name of the Lord. So this doesn't shake Job's faith. Right? And that's chapter 1, basically. Then chapter 2, devil goes back to God. And God says, again, have you considered my servant Job? He repeats the same words, right? It tells you something that this is a poetic structure, I'd say. So have you considered my servant Job? And the devil says to him, well, the only reason he still worships you is because you didn't let me touch his flesh. Let me touch his flesh, and then he won't worship you anymore. So God says, his life is in your hands. The only thing you're not allowed to do is kill him. Or the devil goes down. Satan, I should say, rather than the devil. It's more accurate. Satan goes down and covers Job in boils. So Job is now, like, his physical health is collapsed, right? As well as everything that he loves in the world. Three friends come to visit to comfort him. They sit in silence for 7 days, and Job is the first one to actually initiate conversation. He opens up his mouth and gives this very long soliloquy, cursing the day he was born. I think it's a very beautiful moment. I really like the Book of Job, by the way. I think it's a great piece of literature. It's probably my favorite book of the Bible, to tell you the truth. So Job opens up his mouth and curses the day that he was born. His friends object to this, and they get into an argument. And the contents of that argument we will get into. And then God shows up, right, very abruptly, and he gives this speech, this very mysterious speech. It's a really wonderful bit of writing, and it's the kind of thing that you could just puzzle about for years, right? There are a lot of common interpretations and stuff. I don't think any of them quite do what happens in God's speech justice. but we'll talk about that at a later time. God condemns Job's friends and then restores everything that Job had. I think it says twofold. Atheists love this book, right? Because, isn't God just such a prick, right? For sending down all these torments on this innocent man. I think that it's really difficult to respond to that. It's really difficult to respond to that, for a Christian to respond to that. I think it's one of the most difficult books of the Bible for a Christian to deal with. Something about it doesn't square with the New Testament idea of God, right? God could be so capricious in this way. Inspiring Philosophy gives a reading of the book of Job. It's a really non-conventional reading, and I'm not really sure where it comes from. Now, two things that I should mention here, first of all. It should be noted that we're both working off of English translations, obviously, so there's a limitation there. Also, we will both, or Inspiring Philosophy did, and I will continue to interpret this within a Christian context rather than a Jewish context, because they are different, right? How Christians read the book and how Jews read the book is different. So let me just quickly recap Inspiring Philosophy's reading of Job. He gives a very Protestant reading of the book of Job, I'll say that. I'll try and unpack that as I go along. But I don't think you'd see Inspiring Philosophy's reading represented in a Catholic reading or in an Orthodox reading or something like that. There's something particularly Protestant about Inspiring Philosophy's reading of the book of Job. He tries to demonstrate three things in the video, and the first of those three things is what I'm going to focus on because it's the thing that I object to most. And I think it's the thing that you lose so much if you interpret it the way that he does. Inspiring Philosophy's first premise is that Job had a warped view of God. And one of the reasons why I actually, again, I like his reading. I think it's creative, and I think he makes interesting use of the text. And especially here, he makes interesting use of the text. I think it's a little pedantic. He anticipates this criticism with the atheist will just say, you're just reading into this so much. But I think there's something, I think it's a mishandling of the book of Job to interpret it within an apologetic context. It's almost like Inspiring Philosophy wants to interpret it in such a way that he can respond to the atheist rather than interpreting the book on its own terms. And he says as much, right? He says, something like, hopefully at the end of this video you can respond to atheist objections to the moral character of God, or using the book of Job, or something like that. He gives a few pieces of textual evidence, and I think that they're pretty thin, but they're there. The first one he gives is that if you look at Job, the first sort of paragraph of the book of Job describes the moral character of God, and I have it right in front of me. It says, there was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was perfect and upright, and one that feared God and eschewed evil. And then it goes on to talk about how wealthy Job is. And his sons went and feasted in their houses every one his day, and sent and called for their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. And it was so, when the days of their feasting were gone about, that Job sent and sanctified them, and rose up early in the morning, and offered burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, it may be that my sons have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. Thus did Job continually. Job is painted as perfect and upright. They describe him as perfect and upright, and he fears God and eschews evil. And the reason I read the second part, Job offers burnt offerings, animal sacrifices, according to the number of all of his children, in case his children have sinned. Right? This is something that it mentions specifically that he's anxious about. Now this tells you something about the character of Job. It points to something deeply altruistic in Job. Right? He's concerned about other people. He's not self-absorbed. That's what it seems to say to me. Inspiring Philosophy seems to take this the opposite way. He points to Genesis, where it describes the character of Noah, and it says that Noah walked with God. right? And he says that the lack of that in the description of Job's moral character tells you something. Job did not walk with God. So he was morally upright. He did all the right things, but he didn't walk with God. And a lot of Inspiring Philosophy's reading hinges on this distinction. So yeah, this for me doesn't strike me as being a particularly compelling objection to the character of Job, right? It doesn't seem to me to cry out that Job had a warped view of God. It seems to me to say the opposite. And when God speaks about Job, he says, "Hast thou considered my servant Job, that there is none like him in earth, a perfect and upright man, one that feareth God and escheweth evil." A perfect and upright man, right? That word perfect seems to be a stretch to say that is limited to his actions or his works. Now, the warped view of God, maybe it would help if I say this, the warped view of God that Inspiring Philosophy claims that Job has is that he looks at God as being a means to material gain on earth. Right? If I just do the right sacrifices, then God will give me a good life. Which is very different than considering God to be a person who you love, right? Who you care for, right? There's something unethical about this. You're using God as a means, and if God is supposed to be a person, then you shouldn't be using God as a mere means to get material wealth in the world. And so Inspiring Philosophy is going to use this to basically say that Job had it coming. So all of the praise of Job under Inspiring Philosophy's reading comes down to praise for Job's works, right? But you can't earn your way into God's favor, right? This is part of why I say his reading is very Protestant. This is a sticking point in Protestantism. Not that Catholics and Orthodox people disagree, to my knowledge, but Protestants really harp on about this, about how any version of a works theology is bad. So for Inspiring Philosophy, Job is trying to do all these good works to appease God, but not treating God as a person. He doesn't walk with God. He doesn't appreciate and love God in that way. Now, I would call that hypocrisy. I think that that's the word in religious discourse that you use to describe that person, right? Your works outwardly do this thing, but you don't inwardly feel the authentic expression of that thing, right? They're not an authentic expression of your inner being or your soul, what you really think, right? So there's a gap between what you do and what you really feel or what you really are. That's hypocrisy, and that's a sin. So Job is sinful for Inspiring Philosophy. Perhaps one of the worst sins that exists. Also, you could stretch that, if Inspiring Philosophy is right, if we allow for this interpretation that Job is just trying to gain things in the material world by making the proper sacrifices to God, you could claim that that's a version of idolatry. As such, these are very grievous sins in the Bible. And I think that if Job were a hypocrite and an idolater, it would make more explicit mention of that. It seems to be, the textual evidence seems to be scant in comparison to the gravity of the charges that Inspiring Philosophy is laying at Job's feet. Now, the question of walked with God, Job did not walk with God. This is actually a really interesting point, because I think it's true, right? But I don't think I would interpret it in the way that Inspiring Philosophy does. Job says at the very end of the book, when God shows up, Job says something like, "I've never seen you before," right? And this I think is integral to unlocking what the book means. It tells you something about Job's suffering. as well. But it doesn't strike me that the absence of the statement Job walked with God is an indictment of Job's character. If anything, I think that phrase being missing tells you that it's a different writer, right? It seems like a piece of rhetoric that's just didn't come out of the writer's hand. I don't know. I don't see it as being particularly compelling. Another piece of evidence that Inspiring Philosophy gives, and this one really confused me also, because I think that this is just a misreading. It's just confusion. After God lets Satan destroy everything of his wife comes to Job and says, "Then his wife said unto him, Dost thou still retain thy integrity? Curse God and die." But he said unto her, "Thou speakest as one of the foolish women speaketh. What, shall we receive good at the hands of God, and shall we not receive evil?" In all of this, Job did not sin with his lips. Now, Inspiring Philosophy emphasizes sin with his lips, as though that conceals the fact that Job was sinning in his heart. Right? These words are a lie in some way. If he just says the right words, maybe he can appease God's wrath. Is how he reads this, and I think that this is way overblown. I mean, she instructs him, she beckons him, she advises him, curse God. And then at the end of this section, he says, in all this, Job did not sin with his lips. The sin with his lips part sounds to me to be directly tied to the instruction to curse God. That is, he refuses his wife's advice. That seems to be what that's saying. In other words, she tells him, sin with your lips, and at the end it says he did not sin with his lips. There's nothing about this that strikes me as hiding the feeling. It's hiding his hypocrisy, right? Again, let's use these words, hypocrisy, which again, if Job is being charged as a hypocrite in this book, I think it would be a little bit more obvious and apparent. And also, Job's the hero of the book, right? It's the book of Job. It seems like such a strange reading to me. The other piece is that Job must have been like his friends, and that's I'm going to talk a little bit about what Job's friends thought, but I don't even know if that's implied, right? When I look at this text, it doesn't strike me that that's what's being said, right? That he must have been like his friends. These people are a mirror of what Job would have previously thought. It strikes me to be more like a dialogue, almost in a Platonic sense. And there's a rich history in Jewish culture of dialogue and debate. And it seems that the author of this book is presenting a dialogue about the nature of suffering and how it relates to God in that section. Everything about his interpretation hinges on the following logic. Either Job deserved it, and therefore God is just, or Job was innocent, in which case God is a monster. Inspiring Philosophy says this book used to trouble me and I never used to read it, right? And that the possibility that Job was innocent seems to be the thing that troubled him, because if Job's innocent, then God must be monstrous. It somehow doesn't square with the idea of a loving God, or at least it's difficult to do that. So he opts for Job deserved it. Right? This is the move that Inspiring Philosophy makes. Job must have deserved it. He must have had it coming in some way. God's actions are righteous and just and intended to be instructive to Job. Now, I think that this assumes two things. First, the book is about Job's relationship to God. And I think that's right. I think it is a book, at least in part, about Job's relationship to God. Second thing that it assumes is that this book is about God's relationship to Job. I think that this is a little bit more dubious. I think that this is a parable, and I don't think that this is a book that's about God's character. I mean, you could say in this book that God is a personification of the world or something, right? You could give an atheistic reading of this book probably, and it wouldn't lose that much. In rebuttal to Inspiring Philosophy, the first move that I would make is ask the question, why does this book exist at all? Right? There must be a question that the book is trying to answer. Inspiring Philosophy takes it as a critique of moralism, that is, the particular kind of hypocrisy that I mentioned. God thinks that he can, or Job, thinks that he can do all the right works, and get a pass to go to heaven, which isn't how it works. And the word that Inspiring Philosophy uses is moralism. Now that's a problem in Christianity, and it's a problem that you see especially in the writings of Paul, and the emphasis on a Pauline interpretation of Job here is part of the sort of what I think is the Protestant context that Inspiring Philosophy is working within. And I think that says something about the interpretation that it refuses. Inspiring Philosophy seems to not want to take the text on its own terms, right? And maybe that's just what certain forms of religious hermeneutics do, right? So there's likely precedent for that, but I disagree with it. Now, I think that the question is actually deeper, and I think that it's so much more obvious and so much more clear in the book. I don't feel like I need to make weird textual moves to come to the conclusion. The problem is this: if you believe that the universe is ordered by a just and loving God, how do you reconcile that with events like your children dying and the suffering of the innocent? That seems to be the question. Leibniz coined the term for this. It's called theodicy, right? Theodicy is the discipline that deals with how do you square suffering with an all-loving God, or how do you square evil with an all-loving God, which are sort of two sides of the same coin. Now, that seems to me to be the central question of the book. That seems to be, and it seems mind-blowingly obvious that that's the central question of the book. How do you square the suffering of the innocent with a loving God, or even a just God, right? I have reasons for thinking that this is the central question, and I'll get to those in a moment. Now, the first thing I want to say, though, is that the question of the suffering of the innocent is not an abstract question. It's a question that people live, right? People's children die of leukemia. People watch their, some of the best people that they know gunned down in the street in the world. We have war, we have famine, AIDS, and all these horrible things in the world. And we've all known somebody, I don't know, maybe not we've all, but I certainly have known somebody who's, I can't for the life of me wrap my head around why they suffered as terrible a fate as they did. And this seems to me to be a good reason for people to lose their faith, right? And because of that, it seems to me that in response to this, right, you need a book, right? You need a book that addresses this question. And I think that the character of the book is extremely wise, right? Because it doesn't give a trite answer. It wrestles with the question, right? It doesn't give a simple explanation. You can even argue it doesn't give an explanation at all. It just presents this character, Job. Job is an everyman, right? I think that this is clear. We all know what it's like to feel like I've done everything right, and my world is falling apart around me. That's the person. That's Job, right? And the anger and frustration that spill forth from that, right, are articulated by Job most powerfully, possibly in the history of literature, right? we shouldn't downplay the beauty of this book, the writing of it. I think that when you claim that Job had it coming, that he was some kind of religious hypocrite, a sort of cheap, shallow moralist, you lose that fact, right? You lose what I think the function of the book is, which is to provide a figure of empathy, right? This is what I think Job is. He's somebody whose shoes we can put ourselves in. And his words, I think, are intended to help one wrestle with those kinds of moments. Job, when he speaks, a lot of his, it's almost, I would say, it's almost tailor-made to be reassuring to people in times of radical mourning. He says things, he refers to God as his enemy, for instance, right? He lashes out. He really does. It's really interesting and really beautiful. He's a broken man. And one of the things that this book tells us, I think, is that within a Christian context, it's okay to do that, right? It's okay to go through these moments of terrible mourning and express these things that operate within you. A lot of the book seems to turn on that, right? It turns on the issue of mourning. And again, in Inspiring Philosophy's reading, I think you totally lose that because Job becomes a prick, right? He becomes something, the way Inspiring Philosophy talks about Job, he kind of sneers at him, right? He has this like, well, I wouldn't respond like that to this situation, and blah, blah, blah. And I think that you really miss something there. And I think you take away, in this kind of reading, you end up taking away a key component of the Christian toolkit. The Book of Job, I think, is a key component of that. The capacity, here you have a place in Scripture set aside for wrestling with these kinds of questions. Inspiring Philosophy kind of takes that away, right? I think that's sad. I do, and I think it actually does Christianity a disservice. I liked your video, though. I don't mean to get too critical, but I don't mean to be personal or anything like that. But I really think that it's true. Now I want to provide just a few pieces of counter evidence, and then I'm going to stop this video because it's getting really long. First of all, there's a line in here that I don't know how Inspiring Philosophy gets around. And it's up on the screen in one little part of this video. In chapter 2 of the book of Job, "And the Lord said unto Satan, Hast thou considered my servant Job, that there is none like him in the earth, a perfect and upright man, one that feareth God and escheweth evil? And he still holds fast to his integrity, although thou movest me against him, to destroy him without cause." Right? Like, that seems to me to be the clearest declaration of Job's innocence. God himself says that I destroyed him without cause. I feel like if this were a book about Job's moralism and God's correcting it, this line wouldn't be here. Thou movest me against him to destroy him without cause. I don't know how he gets around it, and I'd love to hear him say something about that. I want to say that there's something very conspicuous about looking at the book of Job, looking at the text of it, and then looking at Inspiring Philosophy's video of it. The book of Job is 42 chapters long. Chapters 3 through 37 are dedicated to the argument between Job and his friends. That's a lot of text. If you sit down and read this book, which I just did a couple days ago in preparation for this video, if you sit down and read the text, you spend most of your time with the argument between Job and his friends. And this is not really represented in Inspiring Philosophy's video. It seems that what his preoccupation is to defame the character of Job so that God gets out unscathed. And he does it to the exclusion of most of the text. I think most interpretations of the book do this, right? If you hear most explications of the book of Job, they just leave out the three friends, right? God sent down terrors onto Job, and Job, kept his faith, and that's the story that you hear. But that's not what the book is about, right? The book is about this dialogue, right? And the evidence that I have is just so much text is dedicated to it. It's very clear to me that this book is about this conversation, and everything else is really just stage setting for this conversation. Now, Inspiring Philosophy interprets the conversation sort of briefly. And he says that the thesis, I guess you could say, of Job's friends is that God is just, you must have done bad works because you now live in a bad life. And so they're falling into the same kind of logic that Inspiring Philosophy accuses Job of falling into. That is, they're looking at God as an instrument for material gain rather than as a person to love, and blah, blah, blah. They're hypocrites as well. I think that he's missing something. If you look at how the conversation goes, it starts out with Job opening his mouth and cursing the day he was born. It's a really moving moment. He really articulates himself and really expresses himself powerfully. Inspiring Philosophy uses this speech against Job. It sounds like a love letter to death, he says, and then he quotes, I think, Psalms, those who hate me love death, right? And therefore Job must hate God, right? I don't think that that's what's happening. I think that Job is just broken, and he's speaking the sorrow. He's articulating the sorrow in his heart, honestly. And this is a lot of the what this argument hinges on. Job is really mad, and in this speech too, Job goes a little bit more into detail about his own suffering, and I think Inspiring Philosophy missed some of this. There's something about Inspiring Philosophy's video where you get the sense that he doesn't appreciate the depths of Job's suffering. So Job goes off on, he begins this soliloquy, and then his friend steps up and says, look, God is just, and therefore you must have done something wrong. I wouldn't even say done something wrong, right? I don't think that he's really talking about works. I think that all he says is you must have been in the wrong somehow. This seems to be the obvious reading. You must have been in the wrong. And so what you need to do is you need to call out to God. And this is something that baffles me, right? Because it seems to mirror Inspiring Philosophy's logic, right? God can't be this capricious monster, so therefore Job must be in the wrong, and he should have called out to God. It's exactly the same diagnosis, and it's exactly the same prescription. The only distinction that I think saves Inspiring Philosophy from this is that he claims that they are advising do more good works, right? And you must have done bad works. But I don't think that that's what it is. I think it's much broader than that. No, whatever. Job's reply is that look, if I'm not innocent, he doesn't really insist on his own innocence. But he says, if I'm not innocent, then show me what I've done wrong, right? I just want to know, right? I want to know what I did, and then just let me die, right? And he refuses to accept blame. Without good reason, right? He demands a reason. This is why Job, I think, is a very heroic character. He's He's not this this sort of whimpering servant, right? He demands a good reason. Now, the fact that Job refuses to accept blame within the logic of his friends amounts to blasphemy. Because remember, either God's a monster or Job's in the wrong. If Job asserts that he's not in the wrong, then that's equivalent to him asserting that God's a monster. This becomes the sticking point of the whole conversation. Job insists, I don't think I'm blameless, and I don't think any of you, these friends, right, have good grounds to lay blame on me. And they insist, well, if you're not blameless, or if you are blameless, then that means that the blame is on God. Therefore the blame must be on you. And the rhetoric gets more and more intense, and they go back and forth, and it gets worse and worse, and Job basically calls them out for being false friends. You're not here with me in my time of mourning, right? You are here to scold me, and screw you guys. And he accuses them of being afraid, right? Very interestingly, he accuses them of being afraid, because if Job's right and he is innocent, then that means that hard times and suffering could fall on them at any moment, and I think that that really gets to them, right? And just read the conversation; it's interesting. It's difficult, but it's interesting. So, but I would say that the logic that Job's friends use, and again the prescription that they provide for him, for instance, Job's friend says here, he says, I would seek unto God, and unto God I would commit my cause, right? That's Job's friend speaking. So, Inspiring Philosophy says, why doesn't Job talk to God, right? Well, he's talking about God so much. Why doesn't he talk to God? This is exactly what Job's friend says. I would seek unto God, and unto God I would commit my cause. I don't know. I see Inspiring Philosophy's interpretation of Job's plight as being just a refined version of Job's friend's interpretation of Job's plight, and it's this fascinating irony. And of course, it must be recognized that when God shows up, he condemns them. He condemns the friends. And he raises Job up. It's really sad, because all Job really wanted was a friend to be there for him and share his time of grief. And they couldn't do it. This is why they're detestable. Right? They couldn't simply share in that moment of suffering with Job. Now, the last part that I want to talk about is God's speech. God enters. Right? God shows up at the end of this conversation between Job and his friends, and God gives this really strange speech. It's so crazy, right? He challenges Job. Gird up now thy loins like a man, for I will demand of thee, and answer thou me. Right? You've been asking me all these questions. Now man up and let me ask you a few questions, right? The speech is really, really strange, and God begins to ask questions of Job. He doesn't give an answer, right? He doesn't say to Job, "Here's what you've done wrong." Instead, he comes down and just starts asking a rapid fire of questions. Where wast thou when I laid the foundations of the earth? Declare if thou hast understanding. Who hath laid the measures thereof, if thou knowest? Who hath stretched the line upon it? Whereupon are the foundations thereof fastened? Or who laid the cornerstone thereof? When the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy, or who shut up the sea with doors, when it brake forth as if it had issued out of the womb? Right. None of this seems to have to do with Job's plight. And this is what's so interesting about the speech. God shows up, and he seems to be making these grandiose claims to arrogance. Look at how much greater I am than you, Job. How could you possibly question me? And many people have read it this way. I think it's more subtle than that. I don't think that that's quite what's going on here. But the only point that I really want to make about God's speech at this moment is that if what God was trying to do was to correct Job's moralism, was to say, don't treat me as a means to getting material wealth, right? You know, this isn't how you approach a person. You're not approaching me like a person. You're, as Inspiring Philosophy puts it, you're approaching me like a vending machine, or a divine genie, right? It seems that this would be the most perplexing way possible to communicate that. Why would this be God's answer? It doesn't seem to fit. Job puts God on trial and is rewarded for it in this book. It doesn't seem to indicate that Job was wrong to be thinking of God in the way that he was. It seems to be saying the opposite. It seems to be vindicating Job. Job seems to be right. Job seems to be correct that there was no reason, that he was innocent. Nowhere does God contest this. So what seems to be happening here, the message of God's speech, and here I'm going to go to Chesterton because I think it's really interesting. He says, the refusal of God to explain his design is itself a burning hint of his design. The riddles of God are more satisfying than the solutions of man. Thirdly, of course, it is one of the splendid strokes that God rebukes alike the man who accused and the man who defended him. He knocks down pessimists and optimists with the same hammer, and it is in connection with the mechanical and supercilious comforters of Job that there occurs the still deeper and finer inversion of which I have spoken. The mechanical optimist endeavors to justify the universe avowedly upon the ground that it is a rational and consecutive pattern. He points out that the fine thing about the world is that it can all be explained. That is the one point, if I may put it so, on which God in return is explicit to the point of violence. God says, in effect, that if there is one fine thing about the world, as far as men are concerned, it is that it cannot be explained. He insists on the inexplicableness of everything. And he quotes Job, hath the rain a father, out of whose womb came the ice. He goes farther and insists on the positive and palpable unreason of things. Hast thou sent the rain upon the desert where no man is, and upon the wilderness wherein there is no man? God will make man see things if it is only against the black background of non-entity. God will make Job see a startling universe if he can only do it by making Job see an idiotic universe. To startle man, God becomes for an instant a blasphemer. One might almost say that God becomes for an instant an atheist. He unrolls before Job a long panorama of created things. The horse, the eagle, the raven, the wild ass, the peacock, the ostrich, the crocodile. He so describes each of them that it sounds like a monster walking in the sun. The whole is a sort of psalm or rhapsody of the sense of wonder. The maker of all things is astonished at the things that he himself has made. Instead of proving to Job that it is an inexplicable world, he insists that it is a much stranger world than Job ever thought it was. This is an incredible answer, right? Job, you demand a reason for your suffering. And this assumes that things have reasons, right? That the world all fits together in a nice, tidy little box. And it seems that God comes out and says, no, I've made a much more interesting world than that. So I want to point out one last thing that I think is totally lost in Inspiring Philosophy's interpretation. I'm going to read one more paragraph from Chesterton. The last paragraph is of his introduction to the book of Job. Or I'm going to read part of it at least. Here's the very darkest and strangest of the paradoxes, and it is by all human testimony the most reassuring. I need not suggest what high and strange history awaited this paradox of the best man in the worst fortune. I need not say that in the freest and most philosophical sense there is one Old Testament figure who is truly a type, or say what is prefigured in the wounds of Job. The best man in the worst circumstance. So Chesterton reads this as a prefiguring of the crucifixion, which is, I think, recasts the whole thing in a completely different light. I mean, people like to say that Abraham and Isaac prefigures the crucifixion as well, and I think that changes the whole character of that story. And I think it changes the character of the story of Job as well. The moral of the story, the lesson of the story, seems to me to be good men and women aren't guaranteed good fortune. The book of Job is the ultimate articulation, the ultimate religious articulation of that fact. And I don't know if you can do a convincing theodicy. I don't know if you can say that God gets out of this with clean hands. Even under Inspiring Philosophy's reading, God still seems to not get out of it with clean hands. God still seems capricious and violent, excessively violent. So yeah, in other words, I think that the book of Job is a lot more interesting than Inspiring Philosophy thinks it is. I don't think it's a feel-good book. I think it's a very difficult book. And I think it's a book that should haunt Christians. It's a good thing if it haunts you, right? I think it's the kind of book that doesn't end in a way that's satisfying. It's the kind of book that's intended to be interpreted and to be thought about. It's supposed to haunt you. And the last thing that I would ever do with this book is tie it up into some neat message of hope and love, as Inspiring Philosophy calls it. I think it does a disservice to the text. I really do. I think it does a disservice to the religion also. I think Christianity is much more compelling with Job as the best man in the worst circumstances. So yeah, time to start editing this video down. Have a good day.